I can remember Amy telling the story with her faded Irish brogue. Amy had met her husband during the war, and when the war ended, she joined him and traveled from Ireland to his family farm in eastern Washington. It's a long ways to go. By the time I met her, Amy was a widow who had already buried 2 of her 3 sons. But what I remember most was the delightful way she was able to laugh and to laugh at herself. In particular, I remember a story she told that was really about being an immigrant. She often talked about how she came here knowing how to speak English, but it wasn't the same English. She had to learn things differently because of the way Americans spoke. Sometimes it was the words we used. Sometimes it was a common metaphor that we're comfortable with that she had never heard before. But this particular story had to do with a thing that we have here that she didn't know about. I mean, she knew what an ocean was before she crossed one. She knew what hills were and what mountains were, although none compared to the Rocky Mountains that she saw on her way to Washington. She'd never seen a bat before, but she knew that they were things you were supposed to be afraid of and hide from, especially at dusk. And one evening, she was out taking the clothes off the line when a swarm of bats came around her, and she shrieked and screamed and dropped the fresh, clean clothes into the dusty ground as she ran into the house. Her husband came out to see what was going on, and she explained that there were bats that had come, and she was running away from them, and so he investigated. It turns out they were not bats. They were moths. I've thought of that story several times the last couple of years because my niece married a young man from Australia, and he's always poking fun at the way we do things, although I suspect he's the one that's often teased for the way he says things or the things he does. But we forget how hard it is to be an immigrant. We forget how hard it is to leave a family behind, to leave that familiar land to go to someplace we've never been before. I was reminded of that in a conversation with someone just this week who talked about how hard it was to move, not realizing how hard it was on her family when she moved out of home until her daughter was old enough to move out. And she realized how hard it was. And she only moved a couple of states away. Can you imagine going a whole ocean away from your family? This is a picture of my friend Willie Banza. Willie is the pastor of the Seneca, Oneida, and Bern United Methodist churches up in the north tier of Kansas. Willie was encouraged by his dad to come to the United States to study because he knew this is the best place to get a theological education. And so he came on a student visa to Dallas, where he attended the Perkins School of Theology. He was then recruited to serve churches in the Great Plains Annual Conference. He changed his status from a student visa to a religious worker visa. I guess that's the equivalent of a missionary. And he began serving churches about a year ago. I first became acquainted with Willie when an email came from the district office. Willie moved to Seneca, and he had no furniture, but he had a parsonage. And so pastors were asked if they had any extra things they could share, so that Willie would have a bed and a table and maybe a chair. But I got to know Willie through a monthly gathering of clergy in that area and got to become good friends with him. The Sunday before we came here, I had the pleasure of hearing him preach for the first time in Bern. We went there on that Sunday between, and I got to experience again how quick he is to smile, to experience again his warm embrace, and to see how his congregation loves him. But it wasn't until this spring that I learned Willie left his wife and 5 children in Africa who are still waiting to immigrate to the United States. We have no idea how hard it is to be the immigrant. In fact, when I asked Willie permission to tell this story this morning, he told me that last November he had gone to apply to extend his visa. He's still waiting for the approval, and his visa expired June 30th, and so he's now no longer able to work or to be paid to work. And so now his church is caring for him while he waits. We have no idea how hard it is to be the immigrant. And so we gloss over the story of Sarah and Abraham, who leave their familiar home of Haran and go to a land they've never, ever seen before. We forget how hard it is to live that far away from family. We forget how hard it is to learn a new language, to learn what the new customs in this new land are. We all have history in our families of immigrants, but we have forgotten how hard that was. And when we forget how hard it is to be the immigrant, we become lax in the way we provide hospitality. School is starting soon. Students will be going to the classrooms. They will meet some students that they've never met before. But the truth is, none of the students in the classroom are the same ones that they left last spring, because each and every one of them has had a different experience through the summer, and so they really are different. And there will be a different cultural norm that goes with their classroom. And so we all know what that's like. We get some flavor of being the immigrant in that setting. Certainly not as dramatic as Amy had, or Willie had, or Abraham and Sarah, but it's a flavor of what it means to be the immigrant. I know for me, moving to Wichita is one of those experiences that has helped me get in touch with being the immigrant. It's been a long time since I've lived in a city that had 4-lane streets. I can't tell you the last town I lived in that had a stoplight with a turn lane. I mean, I go to cities to shop, but living in them is different. I feel like an immigrant in a foreign land. Of course, I'm also aware that I am an immigrant into the digital world. My children are native born. I am an immigrant. And many of you know that I got my first smartphone this week. I know I'm going to need help. I'm going to rely on the natives to help me figure out how to adapt to this new culture. As the immigrant, I'm aware how important it is to ask people to help me, whether that's geographically or digitally, to become a part of this new culture in which I live. I know that the natives are very important in that process. Abraham and Sarah learned about the culture where they lived. We know that because of a delightful story that's later on in Genesis, where Abraham buys some land. And in the conversation there, we begin to realize he knows the language of these people. He knows what the norms are of these people. In fact, it suggests that he has even become a pillar of their community. But the author of Hebrews says he is also a pillar of faith. And what he has done to become a pillar of faith is to step out, to become the immigrant, to become the stranger, to become the foreigner, the one who is uncomfortable where he stands. He could have gone home. He could have returned to his native land, but he chose to stay. He chose to stay because his focus was on the future, not on the past. That's true for Amy as well. When she left Ireland, it was about the future she had. That's true for Willie, who left his family behind because of the future he knew exists here. That's true for me as I think about living in Wichita and among you. But the reality is that most of us in this room are more like the natives than we are the immigrants. And it's up to the natives to make the visitors feel welcome, to help the immigrants navigate those pieces of our culture that they have no clue what it is. It's up to us to teach them the difference between a bat and a moth. And at church, especially, that is essential. When somebody darkens the door of the church who doesn't know about this culture, it is up to us to make them feel welcome and at home. But that attitude doesn't happen just here at church. It doesn't happen just with the immigrant. It's also an attitude that says hospitality is a part of who I am, and so I open the door differently at the office. Or I make room in the aisle at the grocery store because I am the one providing hospitality to the stranger, the one I've not yet met. It's listening to somebody's accent without making that judgment that says, I wish they knew how to speak English better. But instead to listen to them without judging them and allowing their story to inform our story. Because you see, I believe the immigrants have a whole lot to teach us. I mean, they left everything behind, and because of that, they have a different perspective when they look around. They sometimes see things that we have overlooked. They see things that we take for granted. They have so much to learn, to teach us. And it doesn't matter if they are coming to this land from a foreign shore, or if they're coming from another state to Kansas, or if they're moving across state to Wichita. It doesn't matter if they're moving from one school to another school. It doesn't matter if they're coming from the world out there to the culture of the church. They can teach us. That requires us to listen carefully to their stories, to listen without judging, to recognize how difficult the journey has been on their end to be here. When we do that, we allow the stranger to become a friend. We allow the immigrant to become a citizen. They can't do that without us, at least not very well. But they also have a very important lesson to teach us, a lesson that's oftentimes we forget, that the most certain thing about life is the eternal presence of God. You see, it was the faith in that God that allowed Abraham and Sarah to make that journey to a foreign land. It's that faith that Amy grew into when she came into this land. It's that faith that allowed Willie to leave his family. And I'm convinced we all need a faith like that. A faith that steps out into those uncomfortable places and learns to trust God. Will you